Tonight on Bridge City News, Alberta Premier Jason Kenney expresses disappointment as the Senate votes not to kill Bill C-48, which bans oil tanker traffic. Prime Minister Trudeau wraps up his visit to France, defending his progressive values alongside French President Emmanuel Macron. And Southern Alberta law enforcement officers are raising money today with the annual Special Olympics Torch Run.
Your nation, your province, your Southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News.
Good evening. Thanks for joining us. It turned out to be great weather for a bike ride as the annual Law Enforcement Special Olympics Torch Run kicked off this morning. The event raises awareness and funds to support Special Olympic athletes. BCN's Loris Alexander reports.
Here at CASA this morning, a group of cyclists put the pedal to the metal for the annual Law Enforcement Torch Run bike ride for Special Olympics.
This event today is our provincial ride. What we're doing today is we're departing from Fort McMurray and from Lethbridge.
Every year, participants from various law enforcement agencies embark on the ride to Edmonton.
We have officers riding from the Calgary Police Service, Medicine Hat, Lethbridge, Tabor, Blood Tribe, RCMP, a bunch of different organizations, sheriffs, and corrections as well.
The ride is one of many events the Alberta Law Enforcement Torch Run hosts throughout the year.
They do a lot for us, the law enforcement. They do a lot of our Special Olympics, fundraising events, like they said, the polar plunge, the Free the Fuzz, and numerous other events they do every summer. And
Champagne says athletes with disabilities have to work a little harder, and they have all the support of law enforcement officers, emotionally and financially.
It's all about raising funds and awareness for Special Olympics so athletes can participate in sport to better the life, to raise their spirits, and to encourage them to grow self-esteem and awareness and participate in sport with us.
The Law Enforcement Torch Run is the largest fundraiser for Special Olympics, and this year raised approximately $30,000. For Bridge City News, I'm Loris Alexander.
Each year, the Lethbridge Jazz and Blues Festival opens with a spotlight on young local talent. This year was no different, and the young Lions were excited to show off their stuff.
This day is kind of unique in a lot of jazz festivals because it features our local jazz talent that's in the schools. A lot of these kids go on to university to study music, but most importantly, they get a chance to perform in a jazz environment, and we have terrific audiences show up every year for this event, and it's, in my mind, it's one of the most fun events I've been involved in since the whole thing started 9 years ago.
The Young Lions concert is a cornerstone of our jazz festival. Right from the very beginning of starting our jazz society and the jazz festival, we wanted to include the young jazz musicians because they've got so much energy, and to provide them with an outlet to perform and just have a lot of fun with the performing. But it's a great opportunity for all those students to hear the other bands.
This year's event took place at the Gate Church and featured around 225 young musicians from 11 local school jazz bands. David and Colette Steffen returned to the Lethbridge Courthouse for day 5 of their retrial. The couple was convicted for failing to provide the necessaries of life for their 18-month-old son Ezekiel. However, a retrial was ordered by the Supreme Court of Canada. Video journalist Naveen Day was at the courthouse today and said the exchange between the Steffens and one of the attending physicians got a little tense.
Dr. Lori Clark returns to the stand today for the second day of questioning. David Steffen questioned Clark on discrepancies between what was said in the Carson Hospital and what was said during the first trial. Times between Clark and Steffen did get tense during times. The question continues for the remainder of the day.
Premier Jason Kenney says the Alberta government is deeply disappointed the Senate has voted not to kill the Trudeau government's bill to ban oil tanker traffic in the environmentally sensitive waters off northern British Columbia. Some independent senators are opposed to C-48, but nevertheless voted against a conservative written report because they felt it was too partisan and inflammatory. Kenney says the legislation only targets one product, Alberta bitumen, and does not restrict oil tanker shipments elsewhere on Canada's coastlines. He is urging the Senate to reconsider the negative impact the bill will have on national unity. Kenney says if Bill C-48 is passed, Alberta will launch an immediate constitutional challenge. Meanwhile, Environment Minister Catherine McKenna says she is carefully considering the amendments the Senate has made to the Liberal government's Environmental Assessment Bill. McKenna says she is pleased Bill C-69 made it through the Senate last night despite attempts by the Conservatives to delay or weaken the bill. Senators made more than 180 changes to the government bill. The changes take away some of the powers McKenna would have as the Environment Minister to intervene in the process, and they shorten the timeline for getting a project from proposal to approval. Tom Harris, Executive Director of the International Climate Science Coalition, says Canada's impact on the global environment is minimal.
Canada's impact is negligible. We're something like 1.5% of world emissions. China now is twice as much as the United States, and yet they have no targets until 2030. And even after that, for reasons that you can see if you actually look in the base document, the Framework Convention, they can increase virtually forever. So indeed, what you have is a situation where we will be cutting our throats for virtually no benefit, whether you believe the science or not.
Hal Roberts has the full interview later in the program. Canada's oldest woman, whose longevity and zest for life won her national attention, has died at 114. Ellen Dolly Gibb was born in Winnipeg on April 25, 1905, when Wilfrid Laurier was Prime Minister. Teddy Roosevelt was U.S. President, and neighboring Alberta and Saskatchewan had not even joined Confederation. She died Wednesday in North Bay, Ontario. Her obituary credits her long life to great genetics and diet, regular walks, a love of family, and generosity to others. The Canadian economy showed signs of strength in May as it added more than 27,000 jobs, and the unemployment rate fell to 5.4%, its lowest level since 1976. However, CIBC senior economist Royce Mendez noted that when you drill down, some of the details weren't as good as the headline is suggesting. Mendez says the solid jobs report was attributed to self-employment. The number of self-employed workers rose to 61,500, while the number of employees fell by 33,800. Including a drop of 13,100 public sector employees and 20,700 private sector employees. For the Lethbridge Medicine Hat region, the jobless rate was listed at 6.5%. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says he and French President Emmanuel Macron share a similar approach to dealing with pressing issues such as climate change, extremism, and online hate. Following a closed-door meeting in Paris today, Trudeau told reporters that some politicians choose to capitalize on their citizens' fears.
One of the things that we've seen over the past years is an increase in the anxiety that people feel, that people are worried about their jobs, about their future. And unfortunately, there are many politicians who look for popularity given that anxiety and work to amplify or echo back those fears to people without actually offering solutions. What Emmanuel knows, what I know, what we've been working very hard on both together and individually in our countries, has been to demonstrate to people that our institutions can function, our governments can function to support families. Whereas previously governments gave advantages and benefits to the wealthiest in the vain hopes that that would create economic growth that would benefit everyone, which it didn't. We invested instead directly in the middle class and in people working hard to join it. What we saw is not only some of the lowest unemployment rates since we've been recording unemployment rates in Canada for 40 years, but we've seen 1 million jobs created. We've seen a reduction in the child poverty rate by 20%. 825,000 Canadians lifted out of poverty. So it's not about popularity, it's about doing things concretely the right way that are going to make a difference in Canadians' lives and our citizens' lives. That's what we remain focused on, and that's what, certainly on a personal level, I'm looking forward to talking about as we embark upon this election campaign.
Trudeau also spoke out against China, saying they are inventing excuses to block imports of Canadian canola. He used his toughest language yet over the Chinese government's decision to reject Canadian canola on the grounds that inspectors have found pests in it. Trudeau calls the decision to block canola imports unjustified and part of a wider diplomatic row between the two countries. There is also speculation that China may soon block exports of Canadian pork. Hal Roberts spoke with our parliamentary reporter Ray Fillion about this.
The official reason that they gave is they're afraid of some bug, which is known as the African swine fever, which is something that has never been found here in Canada or in Canadian shipments. China claims it has absolutely nothing to do with the current controversy over the senior Huawei executive that was arrested here in Canada at the request of the Americans in early December. One more issue. First it was canola, now an issue over Canadian pork being exported to China.
Watch for the full interview in the second half of our newscast. With the high-profile extradition case of a Chinese tech executive scheduled to begin in January in a Vancouver courtroom, defense lawyers are set to focus their arguments on the concept of double criminality. A BC Supreme Court judge has accepted a defense team proposal to begin the hearing with a spotlight on the legal concept that means no one should be extradited to face punishment for conduct that is not criminal in Canada. Huawei's Meng Wanzhou was arrested last December at the request of the U.S. for fraud and sanctions violations. U.S. Vice President Mike Pence says they are encouraged by Mexico's latest proposals to head off tariffs by stepping up efforts to halt illegal immigration at the southern border. But at this point, tariffs are still set to take effect on Monday.
I've been receiving reports throughout the day as those negotiations have continued at the State Department, and we're encouraged that frankly, the Mexican delegation brought even more proposals today. The president has no timetable. We've announced that 5% tariffs are going to be imposed on all goods coming in from Mexico on Monday. And if we don't see the results that we need to see, we don't see action by Mexico in the months ahead, those tariffs will increase. But that being said, the Mexican delegation asked for an opportunity to meet, to bring us proposals about how they can address this issue and respond to the president's call for action. There's actions they can take. We made recommendations to them. There's been some movement on their part that's been encouraging, but at the end of the day, as those discussions have wrapped up today, we'll evaluate those proposals. We'll present them to the president, but ultimately President Trump will make the decision whether or not the actions that Mexico is prepared to take are sufficient for us to consider changing course. But at this point, the tariffs are going to be imposed on Monday. We've made that very clear.
The U.S. Navy has accused a Russian warship of unsafe and unprofessional actions after it came within 30 meters of an American guided missile cruiser in the Philippine Sea. The U.S. 7th Fleet says the maneuver by the Russian destroyer put the safety of the USS Chancellorsville and its crew at risk. The Chancellorsville was recovering a helicopter and traveling on a steady course when the Russian destroyer traveling behind the U.S. ship sped up and approached as close as 15 to 30 meters. A Washington State helicopter crew has rescued 4 climbers who thought they were likely going to die as they became stranded near the summit of Mount Rainier. Taking advantage of a break in bad weather that had been hampering the effort, rescuers plucked the climbers from the mountainside yesterday morning.
And they tried to swoop in and land, but they just couldn't get in there because the wind was just blowing in that direction. We decided that we're going to try to go down to a spot where it was a little bit flatter, so maybe they can bring a person in and maybe drop some supplies, pick up our sick person. So we went down there, they came in, and they still could not get close enough. At one point he touched down, but was immediately pulled off by the wind. And he showed us that he can't do it, so he's going to go down lower, and that's where they dropped off the supplies, as I found out today, because we didn't know really.
You didn't get
what we didn't get them. Yeah. They dropped them off about 1,500 feet lower, but we couldn't climb down there. This was the ice section that we were trying to avoid. Climbing up is one thing, climbing down is 5 times worse. Yeah, that was incredible. It was like the right moment where I think most of us were like, we can't keep going. We're going to, but we're probably just going to lie down somewhere on the slope, and that's going to be it. And they landed, so that was amazing.
British Prime Minister Theresa May is formally stepping down as Conservative Party leader today, defeated by the Brexit conundrum, leaving others to try and get the job finished. May's time at the helm comes to an end with no public event planned to mark the occasion. Almost a dozen Conservative lawmakers are already jostling to replace her in a contest that formally opens Monday, vowing to succeed where May failed and renegotiate Britain's divorce deal with the European Union. More great family fun movies are playing at the Movie Mill this weekend. With more, here is Len Binning with another Movie Mill Minute.
Well, we've got a new superhero. Brie Larson stars as Captain Marvel. Earth is caught in between the galactic battle between two alien races, and it's up to her to save the day.
Space invasion, big car chase. Truth be told, I was ready to hang it up till I met you today. So you're not from around here?
It's hard to explain.
A Dog's Journey, a great family film starring Dennis Quaid. In this film, his granddaughter is separated, but his trusty dog Bailey, who we remember from the first film, promises to find CJ and to take care of her and to protect her.
Bailey, you've done so much for me. When you come back the next time, take care of CJ. She needs you like I needed you.
And then it happened. I was a puppy again, and CJ was my new purpose.
Well, it's shaping up to be a decent weekend, and we will have the details coming right up. Let's take a look at the 5-day forecast. Cloudy with a 60% chance of showers tonight with a low of +5. Clearing in the morning with the moderate west winds dying down to a light wind, and we should see a sunny high of 16 for tomorrow. For Sunday, more sunshine and 18. Monday, some clouds will roll in with a high of 21. Tuesday, sunshine and 23, and even warmer for Wednesday with a sunny 25 degrees. Looking at the almanac, the average high for this time of year is 21 with an average low of 8. Highest temperature on this date was recorded in 1996 at 33 degrees. Our record low was -1 in 1951. Sunrise was at 5:25 and sunset at 9:35. Here's what the forecasts across the nation are looking like for tomorrow. For Victoria, expect a mix of sun and cloud with a high of 19. A 30% chance of showers for Vancouver and 18 degrees. The Calgary-Banff area has experienced a very cool day today with some snow, but things should warm up a bit tomorrow. A 60% chance of showers late in the afternoon with a risk of a thunderstorm and a high of 12. Edmonton, a mix of sun and cloud and 12 degrees. Partly cloudy and 17 for Regina. Cloudy and 14 in Saskatoon. It was hot in Winnipeg today, reaching 34 degrees, but it will cool off tomorrow with showers and thunderstorms expected with a high of 19. Toronto will be mainly sunny and 22. Sunshine and 24 degrees for both Ottawa and Montreal tomorrow. In the Maritimes, Fredericton, New Brunswick will see some sunshine and 22. A 30% chance of showers in Halifax, Nova Scotia with a high of 16, much the same for Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island. And in St. John's, Newfoundland, expect a 60% chance of drizzle in the morning, then becoming a mix of sun and cloud in the afternoon with a high of 14. The Canadian Federation of Agriculture says trade issues and erratic weather have negatively affected farmer incomes this year, and Ottawa needs to make changes to its business risk management programs as a result. Among other things, the group wants the margin coverage of the Agri-Stability Program, which provides support to farmers experiencing a large profit decline, restored to 85% from the current 70%. The CFA says many Canadian farmers are experiencing difficulties as a result of the ongoing dispute between Canada and China, which has seen China block imports of Canadian canola seeds. Fiat Chrysler is recalling nearly 340,000 Ram pickup trucks worldwide because the airbags might not inflate in a crash. The recall covers the Ram 1500, mainly from the 2019 model year. Fiat Chrysler says a software error can inadvertently disable the airbags and a device that tightens seatbelts before a crash. Most of the recalled trucks are in North America, and nearly 1/3 of the 2019 U.S. models are still at dealers. Facebook has stopped letting its apps come pre-installed on smartphones sold by Huawei in order to comply with U.S. restrictions, dealing a fresh blow to the Chinese tech giant. Owners of existing Huawei smartphones that already have Facebook apps can continue using them and downloading updates. It's not clear if buyers of new Huawei devices will be able to install Facebook's apps on their own. The U.S. Commerce Department effectively barred American companies from selling their technology to Huawei and other Chinese firms without government approval. Now here's a look at today's markets. Recapping one of our top stories this hour, Alberta Premier Jason Kenney expressed disappointment as the Senate voted not to kill Bill C-48, which bans oil tanker traffic, promising to launch an immediate constitutional challenge if the bill is passed. There is speculation that China may soon block exports of Canadian pork. Hal Roberts talks about this and more with our parliamentary reporter Ray Fillion. That interview is next, but first, here's a look at what's happening in and around your community.
Here's your Bridge City News community calendar. As a kickoff to the upcoming Lethbridge Jazz and Blues Festival, come and take in the annual mini festival called Jazz at the Park, Saturday, June 8th from noon to 6 p.m. at Galt Gardens. Enjoy local jazz and blues artists play different styles of jazz like contemporary, groove, and funk. Besides amazing music, there will also be various craft and food vendors to add to this fun cultural event. For more details, visit lethbridgejazz.com. Rehoboth Christian Ministries will host their annual pork roast Friday, June 14th at the Rehoboth Garden Center in Coaldale. This is a come-and-go supper, which will be served from 5 to 7 p.m. Supper includes roast pork, roast beef, potatoes, salads, and dessert. Cost is by donation. For more details, call 403-345-5199. The IG Wealth Management Walk for Alzheimer's is taking place Saturday, June 15th at Nicholas Sharon Park in West Lethbridge. Registration opens at 10 a.m., followed by opening ceremonies at 11. After the walk, enjoy a barbecue lunch. For more information, visit walkforalzheimers.ca or call the Alzheimer's Society at 403-329-3766. And that's your Bridge City News Community Calendar.
More than 5,000 Canadians, including our Prime Minister, were in Normandy, France, commemorating the 75th anniversary of D-Day. To talk more about it, along with other big news from Ottawa, is our parliamentary reporter Ray Fillion. Ray, there were some very special ceremonies which took place in France recently, as we remember so many who fought for our freedom.
It was something to see, quite frankly. Many of those veterans in their 90s, even 102 years old, who traveled all the way to France to set foot, in many cases, for the very first time since 1944 on the beaches of Normandy. There were actually 2 days of commemorations. The first was Wednesday. There was a major ceremony on the British side of the English Channel to commemorate the day when most of those Canadians, Americans, British sailors left Britain to cross the English Channel towards France, where they arrived the next morning very early. They stormed the beaches of Normandy under heavy artillery fire. That was a territory that was, of course, in 1944 controlled by the Nazis, but they braved Nazi artillery. They stormed the beaches of northern France, the beaches of Normandy, and that was the beginning of the end for the Nazis, the Hitler regime, the beginning of the end of Nazi Germany. So that was a very moving ceremony on the French side on Thursday, very moving, obviously, on the British side, but also on Thursday when they had a series of commemorations. As I said, many Canadian soldiers, veterans who were there back in 1944, being there for the first time since D-Day. The Prime Minister was there. He actually got very emotional at some point. We saw him wiping tears when he talked about some of the sacrifices from those Canadian soldiers. So very moving ceremonies. And everywhere, Hal, be it in Normandy, be it here, because we had many ceremonies across Canada. They held a minute of silence in the House of Commons. There was a big ceremony at the War Memorial here in Ottawa on Thursday. And the message everywhere is the same. Thank you, and lest we forget.
Amen to that. Now, before heading to France, PM Justin Trudeau made a series of announcements to help seduce female voters heading into the federal election. Let's talk more about that.
Yeah, the Prime Minister traveled to Vancouver on Monday. He was there for 2 days because in Vancouver you had an event called Women Deliver. It was an international gathering of female leaders from across the globe, around the globe. And he announced that the government is going to be increasing funding to support women and girls' health around the world, including abortion services. We're talking big money here, $700 million starting in 2023. Which will increase to $1.4 billion, Canada's contribution by 2029, so in 10 years from now. And the government didn't stop there. The previous day, his gender equality minister announced $300 million for women in developing countries around the world as part of the so-called Equality Fund. So a lot of money. A lot of people will say they're good initiatives, but it's also part of a political game. As you know, Justin Trudeau, ever since he became leader of the Liberal Party of Canada, he's been branding himself as a feminist. He says he's a feminist prime minister. He never misses an opportunity to talk about what his government is doing to advance the cause of women, not only in Canada, but around the world. So he's actually trying to put his money, or Canadians' money, where his mouth is. Obviously, so close to the next election, big money to try and seduce women voters across Canada.
Well, what's interesting too, Ray, is a lot of the money's heading out of Canada, not being spent right here in Canada to deal with the opioid crisis, homelessness, and other issues that we have in our own country. And the federal election will be here before we know it. It's slated for October 21st. Federal Conservative leader Andrew Scheer says Justin Trudeau is undermining national unity. Can you explain?
Well, that's right. Mr. Scheer was in Edmonton this week to deliver the fourth of 5 major speeches he's set to deliver before the end of this month. So he went to Edmonton. He accused the Prime Minister of mismanaging the Federation. He says relations between provinces in Ottawa are at an all-time low right now. He's promising to unite the country if he does become Prime Minister by having this energy corridor that he talked about a few weeks ago. He's also promising free trade between provinces, because a lot of business people will tell you it's very hard sometimes to do business with other provinces. Some say it's even easier to do business with American states than it is to do business with other provinces in Canada, which is kind of crazy. You know, we're one country, should be easier to do business within Canada. Anyway, governments have been talking about solutions for years. Andrew Scheer claims that he has a solution and he will implement it if he becomes Prime Minister. He also accused Justin Trudeau of turning his back on Western Canada, saying his approach has stoked regional alienation, and we know Western alienation is alive and well these days. You know that better than I do. And he also called on Quebecers to respect oil producing provinces like Saskatchewan and Alberta, because as you know, in recent months, the new Quebec Premier, François Legault, said a new pipeline running through his province is absolutely out of the question. He's calling on the Quebec Premier to re-examine that. And Mr. Scheer says that if he does become Prime Minister, he's going to try and convince Quebec politicians to revive some form of Energy East project that would get a pipeline to run from west to east in Canada.
Absolutely. Let's buy Canadian oil. Keep it within the country here. The final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls was formally presented to our Prime Minister. What did Trudeau have to say about it?
Well, he's promising action. He says that the report won't sit on a shelf gathering dust. The word that stood out, obviously, in this report is the word genocide, because the commissioners say they've concluded, based on international law, that this is what's been happening in Canada for decades. A genocide. The word actually appears more than 100 times in the 1,200-page document. And of course, a lot of people are uncomfortable with that. Obviously, when you think of genocide, you think of Nazi Germany, Hungary, Rwanda, places like that, not Canada. Interestingly enough, the Prime Minister didn't mention the word genocide in his speech, the one he delivered at the official ceremony on Monday in Gatineau, Quebec. And this is something that actually disappointed one of the commissioners. She was hoping that the Prime Minister would acknowledge that there has been a genocide here in Canada targeting Indigenous women and girls. But the Prime Minister didn't mention the word genocide on Monday. The next day, during a press conference in Vancouver, he was asked about it by a reporter, and he did say that the Canadian government accepts the Commission's finding that there was a genocide in Canada. So that's as far as he would go. And as I said, 231 recommendations appear in that report. The Prime Minister is promising action. He says there will be an action plan. It's not clear exactly when it will come, possibly this summer. We'll have to keep an eye on that. But among the 231 recommendations in the 1,200-page report, they're talking about a national action plan to address violence against Indigenous women and girls, a national Indigenous and human rights ombudsperson, a commission also to keep an eye on police forces across the country. They're also calling, and this is one of the most interesting recommendations to me, they want the federal government and provincial and territorial governments, so governments across the country, to recognize Indigenous languages as official languages in Canada, on par with English and French. So it remains to be seen how many of these recommendations will be followed by the federal government. 231.
Wow.
Quite a few.
Yeah, definitely. One of the women who was expelled from the Liberal caucus, Jody Wilson-Raybould, is said to be the leading candidate in her riding. Ray, she's even, in fact, she's ahead of the Liberal candidate right now.
Not by much, but she's leading, according to a poll that was done last week by Main Street Media. If the vote had taken place last week in Miss Wilson-Raybould's riding of Vancouver-Granville, she would have received 28% support compared to 25% for the Liberal candidate. So a three percentage point lead. It's not a lot. 8% would have gone to the NDP, 8% to the Green Party. 14% of people in that constituency in British Columbia say they're still undecided. Main Street also conducted a similar survey in Jane Philpott's riding in Ontario in the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area, the riding of Markham Stouffville. And she's facing longer odds than her friend Jody Wilson-Raybould in BC. If an election had taken place last week, the Liberals would have won with 35% of the vote compared to 30% for the Conservative candidate. And Miss Philpott would have received 19% support. 10% of voters in Markham Stouffville say they're still undecided. The race was close in that riding back in 2015, with Jane Philpott defeating her Conservative opponent by 6 points. So we'll see what happens.
Isn't there talk as well of Jane Philpott potentially going back to the Liberals?
Well, she said she was actually asked the question recently, and her answer was never say never. But I don't see a way for her nor Jody Wilson-Raybould rejoining the Liberals as long as Justin Trudeau is Prime Minister. I think there's some bad blood between the three of them.
Now, explain to our viewers what powers a party-less or independent MP has in Ottawa if, in fact, they have no party affiliation whatsoever.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, they don't have as much power to influence things because we have a party system here in the House of Commons. When you're the government, you're very powerful because you can talk to the Prime Minister, you can present a bill as a government bill. When you're by yourself, it's much, much more complicated. Very, very few private members' bills actually become law. It hasn't happened very often in Canadian history that's happened. You get to ask a question every once in a while, but maybe once a week or once every 2 weeks. You don't wield a lot of power.
Oh, I can imagine, yeah. Now, in spite of frustrations in many parts of the country, and new reports says Canadians actually support equalization. But Ray, I can tell you right here in Alberta, right now, not so much.
Yeah, that's right. That's a survey from Environix Institute that found that a large majority of people outside of central Canada feel their province is not respected within Canada, is not getting its fair share of federal spending, yet 3/4 of Canadians across the country support the equalization program. Only 16% don't support it, according to that survey. As you said, and not surprisingly, most people in Alberta and Saskatchewan, that's where political leaders have complained that their oil money is being used to finance services elsewhere, most notably in the province of Quebec, which in turn opposes new pipeline projects. So opposition is higher to the equalization program in Alberta and Saskatchewan. One surprising finding of that survey, Hal, only 13% of Canadians feel that their province is wealthy right now. Back in 1977, that figure was at 54%. So obviously, a lot of Canadians don't feel good about the way things are in their province right now, or the direction of their province.
There's another trade issue with China, and this one involves all Canadian shipments of pork. Can you explain?
Yeah, China announced this week that they're going to be systematically inspecting every single shipment of pork coming from Canada. That's because the official reason that they gave is they're afraid of some bug, which is known as the African swine fever, which is something that has never been found here in Canada or in Canadian shipments. China claims it has absolutely nothing to do with the current controversy over the senior Huawei executive that was arrested here in Canada, the request of the Americans in early December. So yeah, one more issue. First it was canola, now an issue over Canadian pork being exported to China. The Agriculture Minister, Marie-Claude Bibeau, this week said that she's advising Canadian pork producers to make sure everything is properly labeled, they follow the rules to a T. The Canadian government has also let it be known that they might ask for a face-to-face meeting between Justin Trudeau and the Chinese president at the upcoming G20 summit, which is going to take place at the end of the month in Japan, to try and sort out the many issues between Ottawa and Beijing. They just keep piling on.
A Tory MP from Alberta made headlines for all of the wrong reasons this week. Michael Cooper was expelled from a Commons committee. What happened?
Well, it all started last week during a committee meeting discussing online hate. Witness, who is Muslim, said that the shooter in Quebec City who killed Muslims at a Quebec City mosque 2 years ago was actually inspired by conservative commentators and others. This is something Conservative MP Michael Cooper took issue with, and things got heated. And at one point, Mr. Cooper cited from the manifesto of the shooter who shot people to death in 2 mosques in New Zealand a couple of months ago. And so that was controversial. Andrew Scheer said he had a look at the issue. He decided to expel Mr. Cooper, not from caucus, but from that committee. So Michael Cooper is no longer going to be sitting on that committee. I guess Mr. Cooper could have expressed himself differently. You know, he could have calmly voiced his disagreement that conservative commentators or conservatives inspired shooters in New Zealand and in Quebec City. That's not what happened. He probably went a little bit too far. Now, the opposition have called, not the opposition, but the government has called on Andrew Scheer to expel Mr. Cooper from the Conservative caucus. I think they're also playing political games with that. It's not going to happen. He's going to stay in the Conservative family. But yeah, he made headlines for the wrong reasons this week. And he wouldn't comment, by the way. We didn't see, at least I didn't see Michael Cooper in the halls of Parliament this week.
Our parliamentary reporter, Ray Fillion, joining me once again from Ottawa. Thanks so much, Ray.
My pleasure, Hal.
The headlines continue to shout the end of our planet is near because of man-made climate change. Anyone who questions this is labeled a climate change denier. But how do we know if it's actually true or not? To talk more about this is Tom Harris, the Executive Director of the International Climate Science Coalition, and he's based in Ottawa and joins me now. Tom, thanks a lot for joining me on BCN.
Yeah, it's great to be on, Hal.
Now, you recently co-wrote an article called Science's Untold Scandal, the Lockstep March of Professional Societies to Promote the Climate Change Scare. What are these professional societies doing and why?
Well, it's interesting because they're appointing special panels to write the general statement for the organization that they attribute to the whole thousands of members. The trouble is the panels invariably are supporting the politically correct point of view, even though many members in the societies don't actually support those points of view. So a few years ago, I actually asked some of the societies how many of them had actually polled their members and showed that a majority of their members support the society's statement that it was supposedly being attributed to all of them. And I couldn't find any who'd actually done that. And in our article in PJ Media, we actually talked about how the professional societies are supporting the climate scare by making extreme statements that, in fact, many of their members don't agree with.
At the end of the day, too, Tom, I mean, there's huge money when it comes to climate change, right?
Oh, you're not kidding. Well, right now, across the world, there's $1 billion a day being spent on what's called climate finance. Now, the UN wanted half of that money to go to help real people today adapt to climate change. And of course, climate always changes. Otherwise, where I'm sitting now, there'd be 2 kilometers of ice over my head. So, I mean, climate change is normal. And when people like Catherine McKenna call us climate change deniers, we just laugh because we say, well, we deny that we deny climate change. If anything, we're denial deniers. We say that climate always changes and the impact of humans is unknown, but probably very small. So, the bottom line is a lot of this debate has become pretty ridiculous.
Now, the mantra we hear in the media is that the science is settled. 97% of all scientists believe man-made climate change is a real threat to our planet. Where do they actually get those numbers from?
Well, if you actually look at the polls, what you find is they do one of two things wrong. Either they ask the wrong people. They ask people who study the impacts of climate change, not the causes, or they don't actually poll enough people, or they ask the wrong question. One of the questions they ask is, are humans contributing to climate change? Well, of course we are. When you build a city, you have urban heat island effect where it's warmer in the city than in the country. And probably on a global basis, we are contributing somewhat to the global average temperature because of our carbon dioxide emissions. But that's not the important question. If you're going to spend $1 billion a day on anything, you've got to be sure that it's really worth it. You have to be sure that, in fact, we're causing dangerous climate change so severe that it's worth restructuring our entire energy infrastructure, getting rid of our inexpensive coal, moving over to solar and wind, which is, these are trillion-dollar projects. So they don't ask the right question. The right question would simply be, do you think that we are causing dangerous climate change that we can avert by changing our energy infrastructure? They don't ask that question. And, when they do ask those kinds of questions, you get scientists all over the place, okay? You have people, very few who say, definitely we're not. Very few say we definitely are causing dangerous climate change. The vast majority of scientists are in the middle and say, we don't know, okay? We believe you should reduce pollution and save energy. That makes sense. But the idea that we know that we are causing dangerous climate change, most scientists will not commit to that, and I think that's why the polls virtually never ask that question.
So what does your research specifically say about scientists and their opinions on climate change?
Well, it's very difficult to know because most scientists are quite concerned about not being politically incorrect. You hear stories, for example, Dr. Tim Ball, who you might have spoken to, who's a climatologist in Victoria. He, because of his point of view, has had 5 death threats, okay? People in the United States have had bullets put through their windows in their office buildings. So, in fact, it's very dangerous, not just from the point of view professionally is whether you get promoted or get your papers published, but it's also dangerous personally. It's almost as if, there are various issues in the United States that are like that, and it's strange to think that climate change is one of them. So many scientists, we had something called the Climate Scientist Register, and we decided we would ask an extremely simple question that was totally nonpartisan and see what kind of support or unsupport we got from scientists. We said, basically, do you think that humans are causing climate change that's so dangerous it's worth these kinds of steps? And many scientists said, I don't know, but I won't answer your poll, because they were afraid. We did get, within just a few days, we got over 100 scientists, really well-qualified scientists in the causes of climate change, who did sign our open letter. And that's on our webpage. If you click in the upper right-hand corner, you can see Climate Scientists Register, and we have it sorted by countries. And there are people all over the world, literally leading scientists, who say, no, it seems very unlikely that we are causing dangerous climate change. And there's a report called climatechangereconsidered.org. People can look it up. It's from the non-governmental International Panel on Climate Change. And they cite thousands of references to support the point of view that we're either not causing dangerous climate change or we don't know. Okay, so this is literally thousands of research papers in peer-reviewed journals that are just never picked up by the media.
Now, the federal government has recently stated that Canada is facing a climate change emergency. What exactly is the emergency?
Well, the only emergency is that they might not, Canadians may not appreciate the carbon tax. Okay, that's perhaps the emergency. So they have to scare people. The climate scare, Hal, is based on only one thing. It's not based on observational data. If you actually ask NASA, the Goddard Institute for Space Study, the top people for understanding global temperatures, they will tell you that since 1880, during which time there's been a 40% carbon dioxide rise, we've seen a rise in temperature of only just over 1 degree Celsius. 1. Okay? There has not been an increase in extreme weather events. Sea level is continuing to rise, as it has since the end of the last ice age, but it's not accelerating. You can check the best database in the world for extreme weather events, and that is the state-by-state extreme weather record of the United States. It's on the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration website, and I'll send it to you. You can share it with your viewers. And the interesting thing is that in the whole of the 21st century, over 18 years, only 2 states set maximum temperature records. You go back to the 1930s, I believe it was 1936, 15 states set their records, and it still stands. So what you're finding is extreme weather is actually reducing in the best database of its kind in the world. So all of this, the whole climate scare, is not based on real world observations. It's based on computer model forecasts of what they speculate will happen if carbon dioxide continues to rise. The trouble is, if you go back 50 years, plug in the conditions then, and then plug in what's happened, you don't get today's conditions. In fact, the computer models over-forecast the warming of the past 3 decades by 3 times. So the models just don't work. And when I spoke to Catherine McKenna a couple of years ago at a town hall, I spoke to her afterwards in the hall, she seemed completely unaware that there was any scientists who disagreed. So I gave her copies of the NIPCC, a huge document. 1 volume alone was 1,000 pages. And her main comment was that it was heavy to carry back to her car. Well, only a few days later, she was still saying the same thing. Scientists agree we're causing dangerous climate change. Canada has to lead the way. Well, you know, Hal, even if it were true that we were causing dangerous climate change, Canada's impact is negligible. We're something like 1.5% of world emissions. China now is twice as much as the United States, and yet they have no targets until 2030. And even after that, for reasons that you can see if you actually look in the base document, the Framework Convention, they can increase virtually forever. So indeed, what you have is a situation where we will be cutting our throats for virtually no benefit, whether you believe the science or not.
So Tom, we're actually told that drought conditions have increased and are caused by man-made climate change, which will devastate the planet. Any truth to that? And how about all the forest fires? You've seen in the news here, all of the forest fires here in northern Alberta.
Well, a couple of things you have to realize is before the Europeans came to North America, fires would rage across areas as big as a whole province. And they would burn for weeks until they eventually came to a natural barrier like Winnipeg or like a river. But you know, we've actually had less forest fires since the Europeans came to North America for the simple reason that we're putting them out. Okay, so forest fires are not increasing. That's number one. Number two is if temperature rises, you have more evaporation, you have more rain, the soil is then more moist, and you have a less fire potential. Finally, if carbon dioxide goes up, the pores on the leaves of plants shrink, okay, because they don't need to be as big to take in enough CO2. So the plants lose less water, take less out of the soil, so the soil is moister. So again, carbon dioxide and temperature rising increases the safety and reduces the risk of forest fires.
Now, what about sea level rise? First of all, is it actually happening? And if it is, what kind of an impact will that have globally?
Well, sea level has been rising at about 7 inches per century over the last century. Okay, so it's not a very fast rise. And if you go back about 8,000 years ago when there was a lot more ice, sea level was rising 10 times faster than today. But there hasn't been any acceleration recently, so we don't really expect it will do any more than a 7 or 8 inch rise per century, which is quite easy to adapt. I mean, you're talking about this much in 100 years. So indeed, there isn't anything to fear there either.
Now, the demand is that Canada should replace fossil fuels with green energy. Now, do we have the green technology in place or anywhere in the world that they can do this? 100%? Because I'm of the mindset, to have a little bit of both. Put your energy and investments into green technology and fossil fuels, Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Yeah, I think it's fine to continue the research, especially on solar, because solar is not a mature technology yet. There are probably a lot of advances we can make. Wind, however, is a mature technology. We're getting about as much as we can out of the wind. Countries like Iceland, for example, who have a lot of geothermal, that's a good potential replacement for coal, for example. But we don't have that, generally speaking, across Canada. So there's no way we can replace our fossil fuels. You have to think about it. The world, over 80% of the world's energy is in the form of coal, oil, and natural gas. Okay, wind and solar are a tiny, tiny fraction of that. And of course, they're intermittent. Okay, you don't get solar at night. You don't get wind when the wind is either too strong, at which point you have to feather the blades or they'll break, or you don't get, of course, power when there isn't wind. And the big trouble, of course, is environmentally, wind and solar are not really green. Because if you actually look at how they make them, the materials they use are frequently mined in China under terrible environmental conditions. The rare earth elements, for example, that are used in the supermagnets on wind turbines come from China. China has something like 80% of the world's supply, or at least production. And the conditions under which they're mined are really terrible environmentally and from a human rights point of view. And of course, the bird kill. And the big one that I've learned about recently is the bat kill. The amount of bats that are killed is in the millions, okay? And bats are very important to the ecosystem. They eat insects, thousands every night. And these wind turbines are killing bats, not just by impact, but if a bat flies even close to the blades, the low pressure damages the inside of their brain because of the sudden drop in pressure. Okay, so it's actually bats are being more hurt and more damaged and more killed than even birds, and there's millions of birds killed by wind turbines. So they're certainly not environmentally green. China also, by the way, their major energy source for making wind turbines is typically coal. So you don't save anyway.
Tom, our education system is teaching our kids that humans are causing a lot of the climate change and that it's an imminent threat to our planet, and we should not question this whatsoever. So how do we actually convince rational fellow human beings to have a reasonable discussion on this issue?
Well, I think the best thing is to talk about the impact of the climate scare, because social justice warriors, people who care about the poor, should be very concerned when they look at a province like Ontario, which got rid of our coal stations and tried to replace it with gas and wind and solar and other sources, which are much more expensive. And as a consequence, the electricity prices in Ontario since 2002 have risen over 200%. 200%. Now, that doesn't hurt the rich, but it certainly hurts the poor. There's other examples too. For example, the biofuels expansion is turning lots of indigenous farms into biofuel plantations. It's destroying the ecodiversity in parts of Southeast Asia. I mean, the bottom line is there are huge impacts, not just on our pocketbook, but also on the environment of the climate scare. And of course, if you're diverting $1 billion a day to climate change, then you don't have it for things like water resources. And I have a friend across the river here in Hull who works in water resources, and he was telling me that, you know, the money that goes into climate change is being sucked out of all kinds of other useful environmental programs. Why, for example, do we have the Ottawa River right beside the Parliament buildings, and it's most of the year you can't swim in it, it's filthy. Okay, I mean, people do, but you know, you better wash the toys afterwards if you have your kids anywhere in the river. So, I mean, we have to focus on problems we know that are real and that we can really impact. Things like air, water, and land pollution. But climate change, the idea that we can control the climate in the year 2050, I mean, we can't even forecast it, let alone control it.
Tom Harris, Executive Director of the International Climate Science Coalition. Thanks a lot for joining me today from Ottawa.
It was great. Thank you, Hal.
On behalf of all of us here at BCN, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless and have a great night.